Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Michael Meyer, author of Benjamin Franklin's Last Bet, The Favorite Founder's Divisive Death, Enduring Afterlife, and Blueprint for American Prosperity. It's published by HarperCollins. It'll be released on April 12th. We last spoke with Michael after the publication of The Road to Sleeping Dragon back in 2017, BC, before COVID. He's also the author of The Last Days of Old Beijing and In Manchuria, so kind of a trilogy. He's appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Smithsonian, tons of other periodicals. So like last time we talked, I went figuratively to China to speak with Michael, and now figuratively he's coming to my hometown of Philadelphia to talk to us about our favorite citizen, our favorite founding father, and whose enormous posterior I saw every week when I was a kid and looked at his statue in the rotunda of the Franklin Institute, and which I still think is the best science museum and the most fun ever. There's so much that I love and know about him, but I did not know about the subject of this book, his final bet, which was based on, a trust in humanity, America, and decent basic human instincts, which is kind of hard to wrap our head around these kinds of trusts anymore. Franklin did so much, invented so much, founded so much, taught so much, discovered so much, and all with a great sense of humor, which I feel, if you guys know me, is the most important teacher of all. So welcome, Michael. Thanks so much for coming to talk with us again.
It is awesome to be back, Sam. Great to see you.
Likewise. Well, I guess you know how I feel about the man. I guess we ought to jump right in and talk about this bet. Was it really a wager? And who was he betting against?
It was a wager in that he didn't know the outcome, right? We often say, I hear it appended nowadays, it's called a trust fund, but in Franklin's day, there wasn't such a thing. So he really was putting money where his mouth was. He was trying to see that his ideals would be promulgated and his legacy would endure, not just for 5 years or 10 years, through gifts to an heir, which we can talk about as gifts to his heirs as well, but all the way down 100 years, 200 years after his death. He wanted this wager to remain in play. And frankly, I think he wanted his name to continue to be evoked in the mind of Americans about what he really stood for. And this goes back to something you said in your intro, which I agree with you with, is that I think before I started researching this book, I often thought of Franklin as this sort of stentorian voice, old fogey on the $100 bill, sort of American Yoda, with the cute quips every now and then. But I found in diving into his life, A, he was hysterical, had a great wit, quick sense of humor, always laughed at himself. But B, he was a tradesperson and he was working class through and through. And he ensured that his last will and testament would remind Americans of that.
It's so funny. The book, while it concentrates on the bet, also goes off on all the things, I remember obviously the harmonica, which was great. And I remember the Franklin stove and bifocals, but I could go on. But why don't you tell me some of the other things like the swim fins and electrocution by a turkey?
It was great. So, this, a theme throughout our talk today is going to be sort of this other Franklin, or this Franklin that maybe is missing from our history books, right? The working class Franklin, the inventor Franklin, but really the skilled tradesman Franklin, a tinkerer, someone who was always working with his hands, started doing so as a 10-year-old in his father's candle shop, but all through his life was trying to improve things. And the lightning rod was his invention to literally stop his house from being struck by lightning on Market Street. Bifocals were so he could see out of a carriage and also look down at a page. The Franklin stove was so his wife, Deborah, and daughter, Sally, would have a warmer hearth when they were cooking. The catheter, Franklin improved the catheter, was for his brother, James. And there's a horrible letter, I puckered as I read the letter where he sends James the catheter and says, but now looking at it, I fear it may be too large. And I think, oh, poor James, right? What's he going to do? Swim fins, as you mentioned. I mean, he did this as the mill pond in Boston as a young boy. He wanted to swim farther and faster. He was very afraid of shipwrecks as a kid. His older brother had perished in a shipwreck. Franklin used to put suitcases full of books on his back and practice swimming in Boston Harbor to strengthen himself so he'd survive a shipwreck. I mean, just remarkable mind, always turning. But to bring this back full circle to our theme here today, I just want to add that he could have applied, there were no patents in Franklin's lifetime. That came right at his death when Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State. But he could have applied for exclusive commercial licenses for his inventions, and he refused. And he said, just as I benefit from technology and inventions of other people should benefit from mine. And so I think, we could credit him as one of the founders of the open source movement today as well.
It's funny, you only mentioned this in passing, and normally I wouldn't, but I've been thinking about it. And so since you mentioned it, I'll bring it up, that his autobiography, Davy Crockett and all that stuff, but Elon Musk, his favorite book. And there are so many parallels, some people trash him, but nonetheless, he's kind of like Steve Jobs, kind of like the same kind of person.
He is maybe a bit more likable in person. I don't know. I've never met Elon. I'd like to, and I hope I can ask him if it's true that he really, thinks Franklin's autobiography is his favorite book. But sometimes I see Elon Musk's tweets or the way he plays with media, and I think that's so Franklinian. I mean, Franklin was always tweaking the powers that be. That's what Poor Richard's Almanac was to begin with. He was constantly using pen names, from Silence Dogood as a teenager. My favorite was Celia Shortface. He was always trying to, speak truth to power, or just try to live a little bit to the left or right of prevailing opinion. And so you're right in mentioning that. And as a writer too, people say to me, like, why Franklin? How did you come up with Franklin? What was the spark? And how did you get, why did you follow this thread and keep pulling on it? His letters are digitized, and he left 8,000 pieces of correspondence behind, the ones that survived at least. And when you do start reading the letters, they become so addictive because his voice is so personable. And even though this is 250 years ago, it feels so modern. It's a very modern voice speaking today with that sense of humor, that self-effacing, oh, who am I? I'm just poor old Ben here, even though he's this leading Enlightenment thinker and the first American celebrity.
You work really hard, but sometimes I think when reading this thing, it's like he did more in one day than I've done in the past year. And it's kind of depressing, right?
It is. And I take heart in the fact that looking back, you find that he borrowed a lot of his ideas. He borrowed a lot of his writing. I mean, if we're going to be critical of it as a professor, I could say he plagiarized. But he admitted to it freely. And he often said, toward the end of his life, he said in Poor Richard's Almanac, the last edition of the Almanac, these beautiful sayings, these funny sayings you all have loved reading over the past decades, I should admit, that I've taken most of them from other thinkers and polished them to make them my own. And a lot of his inventions were the same way. They were built on the back of other people. And even his last will and testament was inspired by another man's writing that he thought, I'm going to make use of that. That's a good idea.
What's funny is I tend to go off, as I do from the last interview, and I'll only mention his name one more time. But the thing I found, and I'll tie it back in, that I found fascinating was Franklin loved to admit his mistakes and failures. And Elon Musk does exactly the same thing in his tweets. If someone says to him, hey, you made the fins the wrong way, you need to control it, or the seams in the Tesla are too wide and crooked, he'll say, yeah, you're right. I made a mistake. Talk about the inoculation for smallpox.
Right. So when Franklin was a teenager, he and his brother James had the New England Courant, which was the Boston newspaper that James ran, and Franklin was apprenticed there. And Cotton Mather, the leading Puritan preacher in Boston, was campaigning for a transplantation, inoculation to fight smallpox. And Franklin and his brother mocked Mather and mocked the inoculation campaign. Flash forward to Franklin as a middle-aged man who's lost a son, Frankie, age 4, to smallpox, and publicly comes out in his Pennsylvania Gazette and says, I was wrong earlier in my life combating smallpox, or combating inoculation, excuse me. And it is a safe method. And I want to dispel the rumors that our son Frankie died because of inoculation. He, in fact, had dysentery. We could not give him the inoculation because we thought it would be too strong for him at the time. He perished. No one else should make the same mistake we did. Everybody should believe in the science, right? Follow the science, as it were. He admitted that mistake. He admitted, like you said earlier, in his early experiments with electricity, he tried cooking a turkey with an electric shock, and he himself was so badly shocked. He said the crack was as loud as a pistol shot, that he was lucky to be alive. And then he adds that the meat nonetheless was very tender and lovely. In his memoir, he admits that his first son, William, was likely mothered by a prostitute. He doesn't say the word prostitute, but he says, I spent money and wasted time on pursuits that I should not have. He does not admit owning slaves in his memoir and autobiography. And that's something that I wanted to put right up front in the book, because I thought it was a little strange too. Because when you look back at Franklin's contemporaries, all knew that he and his family owned slaves, and he didn't call them slaves. He called them servants because they worked in the print shop. But his grandson, Temple, who inherited his papers, when he published Franklin's first collected letters, that fact, a letter about owning a slave, was the first letter that Temple chose to reproduce. So it was no secret at the time. And I found that, when you look back at Franklin's biographers and his hagiographers, really, when you face the Franklin shelf in the library, it's sagging under the weight. They, I think, either downplayed or sort of moved the slavery issue to the back pages. But I think this is fascinating because Franklin, we always talk about him as being so far ahead of his time, but he was also very much a man of his time. And although he did have a conversion late in life, some would say too late in life, although he was very good friends with Anthony Benezet, who was his neighbor in Philadelphia, a leading abolitionist, the person who raised the first public school for girls in Philadelphia. He was friends with Granville Sharp, a leading abolitionist in London. But it took Franklin a long time to come around to the right side on this issue. And he did it after the revolution began. And he was eventually, toward the end of his life, in the last few years of his life, he was elected president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And he presented the first petition calling for the banning of the slave trade to the Senate, which, is no surprise, roundly rejected it.
That reminds me, I should have asked it early on, but about what you learned about Franklin. Talk about your preface and how the beginning of this book started, because it's fascinating, because I understand now how you start books,
by blundering in, carelessness usually. So this brings us back to China. So after coming home from China, after being there, I was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers sent to China in the mid-90s. And I stayed on for a decade and wrote a series of books about life in the overlooked corners. And we've talked about those previously together. I came back to the States, and a friend of mine I knew in China was then working for Vice President Biden. And then Chinese President Hu Jintao was visiting DC for his state dinner. And although I didn't qualify for state dinner status, this friend thought, well, I could probably put you on the list for the state luncheon, which was at the State Department. And so I bought my first ever suit at Macy's on Herald Square, and I got on a train and I went down to the State Department. And, from the outside, the State Department really does look like a chewing gum factory, as a critic said when it was unveiled. But then you step inside and you're in the diplomatic reception rooms, and it is, honey-colored herringbone wood floors and Paul Revere silver and Chippendale sofas and those big heavy curtains that catch on fire in movies. And I felt horribly out of place. Yo-Yo Ma was playing his cello. Colin Powell was speaking to Barbra Streisand. And I thought, what am I doing here? I went into a adjoining room to sort of catch my breath. And I put my hand on a piece of furniture. And a voice from behind me said, please don't touch that. And I straightened up and said, oh, I'm sorry, is it valuable? And it was a Marine guard standing in the room. And he said, that's the table where Benjamin Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris. And honestly, I felt so stupid, because my first thought was, okay, I didn't know he did that. And also, what's the Treaty of Paris again? And then I spent my whole lunchtime just feeling like a real idiot, thinking I know more about Chinese dynasties than I do about the founding of my own country. And so went back to the hotel and I did what one does. I started Googling and came across Franklin's will. And I read it through, and it's time to write a book when the book you want to read doesn't exist. And I couldn't believe that Franklin's story did not end with his death, which is how all biographies end, right? It's a biography. It's a story of life.
Yes.
But I realized there's a whole other chapter, a long book, about Franklin's third act.
Wasn't that Marine really nice to you?
I think he was a bit bored because he wanted to tell me everything he knew about Benjamin Franklin, which I have to say I appreciated, because I didn't know that Franklin spent most of the last 3 decades of his life living overseas, both in London and in Paris. I didn't know that Franklin is considered the founding father of the Foreign Service. I didn't know that Franklin, as an older gentleman in Paris, played up his Americanness and refused to powder his hair and grew it long to his shoulders, and pretty much invented business casual, from what I could tell, sweating through that cheap suit, because he was always dressed in very loose fitting clothing when he was at court and so forth. I didn't know all that Franklin had done, not only to secure victory in the revolution with money and armaments, but also the people he introduced, from Lafayette to Casimir Pulaski, the father of our cavalry in the Revolutionary War. And so the Marine, he even said to me, like, he's on your passport. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the Great Seal and E Pluribus Unum, our motto. He said, that's also has Franklinian roots. And so it got me thinking again. I thought, why is it that I know so little about this person, except for what I see on the $100 bill?
Yeah, and the thing I think most Americans don't recognize, because he is a founding father, is that he wasn't really around.
That's a good point. You're right. He wasn't around, and he wasn't like the other founders in that he was much older than they were. He was old enough to be their fathers, and B, he wasn't, gentry or married into gentry or married into huge land holdings the way George Washington did, the way John Adams did, the way Thomas Jefferson did. He inherited land from his father and then ran his farm into the ground. And I think, again, when I think of the founders, I think of slavery, and I think of plantations, and I think of a sort of detachment, if you will, from how most average everyday Americans live their lives today. And with Frank, I don't have to tell you this as a native Philadelphian, when you start learning about Franklin and reading about Franklin, you're like, oh yeah, he's a printer. I mean, he could easily be on Market Street today running a newsstand or having a graphic design company. He'd fit right back in there.
Yeah, whenever I'm downtown, I'm on Market and 4th, walking up Market, usually stopping at a bar every once in a while. The Blue Martini is right there on 4th and Market. And you've been there too, I guess. And yeah, really, when I said at the beginning about being in Philadelphia, I'm inculcated going to his grave site and watching everyone throw pennies on it. It's just, and it will, for so many people in Philadelphia, really bring you back to things. And the one thing that really got me was, I interviewed David McCullough, and I saw him, and he signed the book, and it was John Adams. And even the critics say, oh, he's really in love with John Adams. And then I read your book, and he's a complete asshole.
Vis-a-vis Franklin, yes. He's a really interesting guy. I didn't know that John Adams defended the British soldiers that shot down Christmas Attucks and the other Bostonians in the Boston Massacre. He's a lawyer, that's his job, I get it. But, starting from that moment on, going forward with Adams, I thought, boy, he's the polar opposite of Franklin in so many ways. He doesn't seem to have a sense of humor, or at least I think he's really funny. Perhaps he's unintentionally funny. There's a line, Franklin is dying in Franklin Court off of Market Street there in 1790. And meanwhile, Adams is writing to their mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, in Philadelphia, writing about, history is going to be this series of lies, that Franklin had his lightning rod and he struck the ground and outsprung George Washington, and they were the ones that drove the revolution. And as he's going on in the letter, though, you get down to the bottom of it, and Adams says, but, my friend, to Benjamin Rush, people 100 years from now are going to read this and think, oh, that John Adams, he's just envious. He's just full of envy. He said, the truth of the matter is that a nation can only love one man at a time. And then the letter ends. But then Franklin dies 13 days later, and I was shocked to find out that Franklin was not that man that America loved at that time. He had a very divisive death, as the subtitle promises.
Yeah, that maybe was the biggest surprise for me, that he was more extolled in France, and the autobiography was published and translated there before it was published in the United States. That was a complete surprise. I just thought everyone idolized him like I did.
As a Philadelphian, you're right, because I think Philadelphia at that time, the population was estimated at 28,000, and The Gazette at that time said 20,000 turned out for his funeral. I mean, it was the largest crowd ever assembled in what was then America's largest city. And I think all of us, if you were to ask each other, like, oh, what do you think Franklin's funeral was like? That's probably what we would have come up with, some sort of scene like that, or the pallbearers walking from Franklin Court to the Christ Church burial ground, a long block and a half away. But then you go, but what happened at the federal level? You know, the Capitol was in New York City. What did George Washington say? What did Thomas Jefferson do? And the fact is, there was no state funeral. And that surprised me to no end, that the first American state funeral wasn't held until George Washington in 1799, 9 years later. Washington declined to have a state funeral for Franklin because he said he didn't die in office and he didn't die in battle. And if we start this now, it sets a precedent. Like, how are we going to honor somebody in death? But the larger issue is that, you know, Congress, the House of Representatives said, we're going to wear badges of mourning, they called it, a black armband in honor of Franklin. John Adams, as vice president, was president of the Senate and immediately rejected that idea. And the Senate said, we're not doing this. We're not wearing badges of mourning. And in the book, you know, I found a diary by a Pennsylvanian senator named William McClay. And McClay's Scotch-Irish, Presbyterian, really good sense of humor also. Something about early Philadelphians with their great senses of humor. But he says, I'm sitting in the Senate. There's only 28 senators then, and 14 states. And he said, I'm watching John Adams, and he said, he strikes me. He reminds me of a monkey set into breeches. And he's not smiling, but he's doing what the Scotch-Irish calls smudging. You know, that self-satisfied.
Oh, I know.
It's smudging, right? And McClay says, I'm not a big fan of Franklin either, but I could not think to paint the devil so black, that he was really chagrined at how little fealty that the Senate was showing him. And then, as you allude to, this goes on for months, this stalemate about what should we do to memorialize Benjamin Franklin, because meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Paris has come to a standstill. France has come to a standstill, and they're doing a period of official mourning, encomium after encomium, official eulogy after official eulogy, proposals for grand monuments and weeping in the streets and everything else. Meanwhile, in the States, nothing. The federal government refused to mourn him.
I guess I don't like, but I have to do it, bringing it up to our situation in America now. But it reminds me of Fox News. Like, when the French write this letter, they're expecting a response and everyone keeps handing it off. Tell about that, because that really pissed me off.
I think you and William McClay and Thomas Jefferson alike, because that comes to a head finally when they do act on it, where the Philadelphians and the Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans, stand up and say enough. Okay, so I guess we could excuse. So the French, you're right. They put together a packet. The National Assembly puts together a packet of all their speeches and all their laurels for Franklin, and they send it to the national capital, which at that point was leaving New York and trundling toward Philadelphia. And they expect to be lauded for this. Oh, thank you so much. We're so honored. And oh, by the way, here's what we did on this side of the ocean. And instead, you're right. That envelope gets kicked from office to office. Washington refuses to open it. Jefferson says, it shouldn't be me. I'm just Secretary of State. And Jefferson's Franklin's friend. He admires Franklin. Says the Senate is the one that should open this. Adams refuses to open it. This goes on for months. And the thing that shocked me was that Franklin's official American funeral and official American eulogy didn't take place to nearly 11 months after his passing. And even when the government got together and said, okay, we have to do something about this and we have to reply to France, the Federalists had so much antipathy and so much enmity, I should use a word I could pronounce, for the French, that they said, we're not going to tell them what we're doing over here. And we're not going to acknowledge how much, they admired Franklin. And instead, when we have his official eulogy read, let's choose someone who hated Franklin. And so the guy who stands up to read Franklin's eulogy in Philadelphia at the official funeral is literally the man that Franklin loathed the most when he was alive. I mean, you talk about kicking a man when he's down, right?
Yeah, and the thing about your books that bring things to life is when I read what you told about his eulogy and part of it, and his daughter talking to him, I really felt like getting up and going downtown and beating him up. But there's no there's no one to beat up, you know?
This guy was an Anglican preacher who Franklin's friends, including Ezra Stiles, who was president of Yale and himself a minister, had said, this guy's an alcoholic. He's too fond of the grape. He will never be made bishop. He had a lousy reputation in the States. Franklin had actually invited him to America because Franklin chose him in the 1750s to head up the Philadelphia Academy, which was the university he was co-founding at the time, which went on to become Penn. Samuel Johnson was Franklin's first choice, and makes much more sense when we know Franklin the writer and Franklin the Enlightenment thinker. But Johnson said, I'm not leaving London and I'm too old for the post. And he was only 40 at the time. So Franklin had read something that William Smith wrote. And so he thought, well, I'll try him. And he brought him over and to head up the Philadelphia Academy. And, William Smith turned in to be sort of like the template for John Adams in a lot of ways. Like, he loathed Franklin. He was envious of his popularity. He thought he was undermining the Penns in the Pennsylvania Assembly, because you'll know this, Pennsylvania was not a crown colony, it was a private colony. And Franklin was always, always agitating for the Penns to pay their share of taxes to fight the wars against the French and Native Americans in present-day Pittsburgh. So William Smith starts saying, I'm going to get in with the Penns by telling them I'll spy on Franklin for him. And then Smith was the man that we can thank for circulating all the rumors about who was the mother of Franklin's firstborn child, William, because he's putting in the press these horrible limericks and ditties. And, the listener and the viewers can fill in limericks and the body parts that rhyme. I mean, they were that bad. And he alleged that Franklin had impregnated a servant girl, someone who cleaned privies, and then left her to die, would not support her. And so for the first time, Franklin lost the re-election to the Pennsylvania Assembly. And that's when he finally ships back out to London and says, well, I'll go be colonial agent over there instead. So not a great guy. And he's the guy that gets chosen to deliver his eulogy. And it's a terrible eulogy of all the inventions that he could have extolled in front of this church full of people, including George Washington and his entire cabinet. The Reverend William Smith said Franklin invented the fireplace flue. That was the only invention he cited. And you're right, when he walked out, his daughter, William Smith's daughter, said to him, I don't think you believed half the things you said about old Ben Lightning Rod, did you? And William Smith answered with a smudge. the self-eating, eating grin. Yeah.
I'm gonna start using that expression. No one will know what I mean, but
isn't it great? Smudging.
Well, yeah, because you know exactly what it is. It's not a smirk. It's not a grin. It's not a smirk, but you know exactly what it is. And the thing about it is, bringing it back to my time, with the bookstore, here's the way I look at it. You get like 1,000 Yelp reviews and they're all 5-star, but then you get like 3 that are 1-star, and you realize those are the idiots. I think people who, when I see a couple for a restaurant, when I see a couple bad reviews and 100 good reviews, I know it's a really good restaurant. You know what I mean?
Right. That makes sense. Sure. Franklin was a little more thin-skinned than you. He took that criticism to heart. He really did. And it shaped his life. And it will, tell me when you're ready, because we'll launch into the will. But I really do feel like a lot of the things he left in his will were score settling. It was, before I leave, I know my will is going to be published, and I want to set the record straight about a couple things here. And I want to make sure that in the long run, it's my name they're talking about and my values that are being propagated and not theirs.
Yeah, and it's like reaching afterlife, reaching back from the grave, talking about his son specifically. He didn't have to, but talking about his son in the will and why he was leaving him what he did.
So William, this is another thing I didn't know. I mean, you're a Philadelphian. I honestly, growing up, never once thought, hey, where did they fly that kite? And did he do it all by himself? And it turns out I was fascinated by the fact that, Franklin started the lottery to erect the steeple on top of Christ Church, which is still there. And his reasoning was not wholly pious. Although his wife, Deborah, subscribed to a pew at the church, Franklin wanted to stand in the steeple and fly a kite so he could test his theory that lightning was electricity. But the steeple wasn't being built quickly enough. And so he struck upon the kite idea instead. And it was in the Northern Liberties. It was William's pony pasture and a stable, right? And William probably held the kite as Franklin touched his knuckle to the electrified string. So they have, William is raised to be Franklin's heir apparent. He's going to be the person who inherits the scientific the experiments, all the equipment, his papers, his post in government, everything. He's grooming him for this. And then William gets appointed colonial governor of New Jersey. And after Franklin is called out in London, he's roundly criticized in the Privy Council as being a traitor and not a loyal subject of the crown. And he's really a rebel American. And it really, changes Franklin's brain to, I'm now a rebel. I'm going to be a patriot. He tells his son, William, you should resign your post, do not serve the king anymore. And William said, nope, I like my position. And William held firm to that and was a loyalist all throughout the Revolutionary War, even to the fact that when he was arrested and put in a Connecticut jail cell, rotting away, George Washington would not parole him and let William go see his dying wife in New York City. And Franklin really never forgave him for this. And in his will, you're right, he knew his will would be published, and the first beneficiary is his son, William. And you're right, he could have just deleted him and not mentioned him in the will. And instead, he pointedly says, because you endeavored to deprive me of my estate in my lifetime, I will now deprive you of yours. And he gives him a bunch of worthless land up in Nova Scotia, which again, William would have been like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. This frozen tundra, that's worth nothing. And that's what he gets. And William ends up living in exile in London, all by his lonesome.
Isn't it funny how you and I keep smiling because it goes back to my introduction, and that's what I'm saying. It's the most important thing, because when you're studying or writing a book, sense of humor really brings you along in the book. It really helps you go through it because you can't wait till the next joke, even though you're learning at the same time. And
yeah, and this is the thing too. And I don't want to criticize the way we often read history or are told history, but it's often so weighted and serious. And you think, we want to make them human, right? We want to make them flesh and blood. I'm an English professor, so I always tell my students, we read, the reason it's called the humanities, it's lessons in being human, right? That we're reading these books because these are manuals about how to live or not live your life. That's what we're doing this for. And when I'm reading Franklin's will or reading his, you think, I know people, I have family members that have that same streak in them, which is, this is to the grave and beyond. You've crossed the line, and I'm going to make sure everybody knows it. Very human. He did not turn the other cheek at all.
I keep wanting to go back to the bet.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, okay, I will. But one more thing was, I really loved his wife's letters because the phonetic aspect of them, and also, the way she erected the magazine. Tell a little bit about her, because we can't leave her out.
This is another thing too, and I put her right up front in the book because most Franklin biographers are men. I obviously am a man as well. However, Deborah reminded me so much of my mother. My mom's in construction. My mom can read blueprints and price jobs. I can't. She's the smart one, not me. And when I was reading Deborah, I thought, she gets introduced in most Franklin biographies as sort of, she gets a walk-on role in the blockbuster production that's his life. And in the book, you know this, I go through and look at the adjectives that people use to describe her over the past 150 years. It's always, she's plain, she's sturdy, she's dutiful. I think, give me a break. Like this is a person that is a whip smart, fantastic businesswoman, great mom, pious churchgoer, and very much part of her community. It's always said like, oh, Franklin went off to London and Deborah refused to go with him, as if she wanted to be some homebody. She's an active member in Christ Church. She's running their business, and you can look at her ledgers at the American Philosophical Society. She's selling barrels of mackerel. Philadelphia was a massive port in those days. So coffee, mackerel, chocolate, and she's calculating all these transactions in many different kinds of currency, South American currency and Mexican currency and British currency and French currency. She's taking, they had bought different plots around Market Street and invested in real estate. So she's running their real estate. She's making sure that people are paying their mortgages, and Franklin gave her power of attorney. And this is another thing that blew my mind. The pre-printed forms in 1730s and 1740s and 1750s Philadelphia said, I grant my friend, that was the line, and then you write the man's name. And Franklin had to cross out friend and grant my wife, and then write in Deborah's name, because he trusted her in all the business affairs. So I find her to be remarkable. And you're right, I wanted to use as much of her words as I could fit into the pages, because her writing is witty, It is phonetically spelled. I wanted to maintain that because she was denied formal schooling. And yet, despite that phonetic spelling, or maybe because of it, her personality is so large on the page, and you can totally see why they were in love with one another and why their original relationship failed. You know, Deborah's mom did not want her to marry Benjamin, and Benjamin went on to inherit a lot of that property that the mom and the husband had held. You know, they courted, they had a spark. He goes off to London. He's away for a year and a half. She feels he abandoned her. She marries another man, John Rogers, that it turned out probably was already married. So he skips town and ends up going to the West Indies. We don't know if he died or not. Franklin comes back from London and says, "Oh, Debbie, I'm back." And they realize they can't legally wed because the penalty for bigamy in Pennsylvania was like 39 lashes and hard labor for both of them. And so they enter a common law marriage. And even more remarkable, I think, is Franklin brings William into the marriage with him. Oh, and by the way, I have this son. Now, maybe Debbie was the mom and they concealed it really well to stay away from the beadle or the sheriff. I don't know. You know, that's all conjecture. But she seems to me to be very, very forgiving, and very big-hearted, and just an all, you know, everybody says, "Oh, I would love to spend time with Ben Franklin." I'd like to hang out with Debbie as well.
Yeah, you know, again, the reason why the book is so alive is because her last letter to him, I almost cried, you know.
She wants him to come back. He's in London. She's had a series of strokes, and you see in the letters that her thinking is getting a bit blurry. But she doesn't want to offend him, she says, and I don't want to cause any trouble to you, which is just heartbreaking. And he keeps saying, "Oh, I'll come back, but he's very curt and sort of abrupt with her, I think, at this time. And then there's no letter. And then, you know, these letters are going 6 weeks in one direction, 6 weeks in the other. So they're crossing over one another. And there's a gap in the correspondence from her. And he writes and says, "You know, you haven't been writing back to me. You know, why aren't you writing to me?" And then the letter from William comes that "My dear mother died." And Franklin receives this letter and finds out that Debbie passed away in his absence and was buried in his absence. And the house that she built, which was called Franklin Court, which she helped design and she oversaw all of its construction, they never got to live in it together. I thought that was really sad. So when Franklin does come back from London, finally, he enters an empty house that Deborah had built for them. And this leads to his wonderful epitaph, though, right? I love that for all the achievements, and if any viewer has seen Jefferson or Washington's graves, you know, oh, he's elaborate sort of. I love that for everything Franklin could have said that he wanted on his tombstone or his epitaph, all he wanted, and it's right in the will, is he just wanted his name and Deborah conjoined with Franklin after it. You know, that for all his achievements, I felt like he thought Deborah was his best.
I can't get back to the bet because now I want you to tell me about the design of his gravestone, the flat gravestone, and what it's supposed to look like. That was so cool. I had no idea.
His will is so fun to read because I mean, all wills tell stories, right? The stories of a life. But Franklin's, like, you're reading it, you're thinking, this guy is so sharp to his dying days. He's suffering from pleurisy. He's got a kidney stone. He's taking horrible medication for it. Laudanum and opiates, and he's losing his appetite. He's skeletal at this point. And yet he still has the presence of mind to design a tombstone that's not vertical, but completely horizontal. And it has the same dimensions as a page of newsprint. I just love that. And he has just on the headline is, Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. And that's all it says on it. You said too, you notice as a Philadelphian, people going to throw pennies on it. I love that image too. It's funny. The guy who tends the cemetery said, "I wish they would just throw $100 bills every now and then." The paper currency is far less abrasive.
Okay. So again, comparing it to current times, one of the words you use, and again, you bring it forward, is that the bet was in a way, the first, just like everything else he did, the first example of microfinance.
Yeah, it was. I really think it was. I think it was not only was he our founding philanthropist for all of his charitable works, which he refused to name after himself, far cry from today, no self-advertising for Benjamin. He self-advertised in other ways, I suppose. But his dying, okay, so let's just explain the bet here. So Franklin writes his will, and then 9-10 months before he dies, is, oh, I got to add something to it. I forgot. And he had this conviction that people who serve in public office should not be paid. And the rest of the Constitutional Convention delegates laughed at him and said, well, that's ridiculous. He said, no, you don't want people who are chasing profit in office, because their avarice will become your ruler. We don't want a king again. And so when he was appointed president of Pennsylvania, governor, for 3 consecutive one-year terms, he never accepted the salary. So he had that salary on the books. It was a little over 2,000 pounds British. And as he's dying, he says, you know what? I want to make a point here. That money that was due to me from the state, I want to pay that forward to the rising generation. And just as I was helped in Boston and in Philadelphia by people stepping forward and supporting my education and supporting my business, I want to be the person doing that going forward and set an example for Americans. Okay, great, I think. That's really great, Benjamin. You're going to take some money and you're going to give it to people in 1790, Philadelphia and Boston, and off they go. But that was not what he did, right? He really did put a wager on it. He said, look, I'm going to take 1,000 pounds of this money, equivalent to about 4,500 then. Really hard to do historical conversions of old money. Purchasing power of millions, we'll call it. It was a lot of money at the time. 1,000 pounds goes to Boston. 1,000 pounds goes to Philly. He knows these cities are rivals because he thinks to add there, if one of the towns refuses to do what I bid, the other city gets all the money. So that's his first condition. Second condition is someone's going to step forward in each city and do this for free. They're going to manage a loan scheme. And this 1,000 pounds in Boston, 1,000 pounds in Philly, we're going to loan this out at small amounts to people who have completed their apprenticeships and want to start their own businesses. They're going to pay the money back over a period of 10 years at a discounted interest rate of 5% at the time. And then that money, as they pay it back, the principal will grow. It'll keep getting larger. We can fund more tradespeople and skilled workers that want to start their own businesses. And we're going to do it for 100 years. And then after 100 years, Philly and Boston can get together and say, let's take a chunk of the money and decide as a city what we want to build to benefit the common good. But then he wasn't done. This is what blows me away. And then put the rest of the money back in the pot and lend it out for another 100 years. And on the bicentennial of my death, which would have been 1990, Philly and Boston could do something even bigger, because by my calculations, this is going to be a massive windfall, and you can really build something to benefit the common good.
And the funny thing was, although I recognized Philadelphia in it, was the fact that the trustee in Boston looks at the different amounts that have been accumulated and goes, what the hell are they doing in Philadelphia? But I see it every day in Philadelphia. Like the mayor gives all the concessions at the airport to his brother. His brother is not necessarily the right person to give it to, but he does. And no one says a word. So talk about that a little bit.
I'm going to let you say that as a native Philadelphian, but one refrain, there was a line in the book, a guy said to me in Philly, he said, look, everybody in Philly knows a guy. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, this city has been, run like this since its inception. And Franklin benefited too. He put his brother, his son-in-law, and his grandson in posts of profit as well, government posts. But yes, and here's the funny thing about the money, and this is the story of the book, is that Boston and Philadelphia, two very different cities, surprise, surprise, manage Franklin's bet in completely different ways. And although one city accrues much more money, I would think the other city was trying to adhere closest to what Franklin wanted, right? And this is what's frustrating about when you read the history and you think, well, what would I have done? And which was the proper course? And then you look at the end of what the money has built and where it is today, and we'll get to that. But Boston into the early 1800s, at the time when the fund really started taking off, was a city known for churches and academies. It was Harvard, and it was the Puritans. And it was also the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution with the textile mills on the Charles River in Lowell. And it was the beginning of the great family trusts. And it was where the mutual fund was invented. And it was where the first investment bank was invented. You have mayors serving in Boston that are descendants of Quincy's that Franklin knew. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, you have a non-homogeneous city that's an active port that is known for its publishing and finance and government and trade. And its mayor is a Wharton who was elected 16 times, and he said, I have a decided distaste for learning. He had apprenticed as a hatter. And this is very Philly, right? And so the cities at the time are completely diverging in what their paths are as cities, what their families are doing. Boston families like serving in government. Very few Philadelphia families ran for Senate. Very few Penn graduates decided to go into public service and represent Pennsylvania. And it's running its fund completely differently. And I think this is what's fascinating is, I don't know, you tell me, like, who did a better job of it? Do you look at the bottom line? Or do you look at who was sticking to the letter of Franklin's spirit, even if it may have been misguided? I don't know.
Well, the thing about it is, if you read the title of the book, the first thing that intrigues you, and again, why it's such a good book, is, okay, where's the money now? How much is there? Who has the most? And what are they doing with it?
And I was, debating this as I'm writing it, because you think, should I do the chapter titles with like scoreboard, where you have the money amounts? But then I started finding that, well, the reader can only take in so many figures and, like numerals at a time. And it's really tough too, because the historic equivalencies, like if I said to you right now, oh, in 1890, Boston was dealing with a $2 million pot, you'd be like, $2 million. Nowadays, that doesn't even build a toll plaza. But at the time, that was enough to, what became Fenway Park was built for $35,000 at that time, right? This is a lot of money they had to decide what to do with. And I was fascinated too with, I think Franklin was sort of winking at future Americans about like, I just went through the Constitutional Convention. No one got along for months in sweltering heat. I got back from Paris. No one's paying my expenses. They're not even paying my grocer's bill or my wine merchant's bill. No one is saying, good job, Benjamin, to me. They're all freezing me out. In a way, I was laughing as I was researching this. I thought he knew that 100 years from now, Boston and Philly were going to go at each other's throats within the city council and the public meetings about how do we decide what to do with this money. I mean, Philadelphia looks the way it does in large part because Franklin went at it on his own. The Penns were terrible landlords, he thought. So he's like, I'm going to improve the property myself. We need a library. We need a fire station. We need street cleaners. We need a militia. We need a college. He was doing all that really on his own. He was raising funds for it and inventing the matching fund for the Pennsylvania Hospital and other things. But I just loved looking back at the transcripts of these public meetings in 1890 and then 1990 and going like, oh, Franklin just knew. We've been fractious from the start. This is what democracy is, right?
Yeah, and bringing it back home to me is like, my grandfather died at Pennsylvania Hospital. My brother lectures at Wharton, with Franklin Institute, the library, the fire company. But I could go on. And it's just, how the hell is that possible? And like you said, he could have named them like Trump does. And he could have said, the Franklin horse poop picking up, and he just.
Absolutely, yes. And he didn't.
No.
He said you could get more people. He said you could get more people to give to your cause if you remove your name from it. They want to feel like they can add their own, stake. They have their own stake in this. And that's a really far-sighted thing to say. Because I do notice this teaching on college campuses. Everything's named for everybody now, right? The plaza, the cafeteria, the desk, the bike rack. And it's hard then when you go hat in hand to families that were already gouging them on tuition and say, hey, can you kick in another $1,000? Because I think, well, no, Bloomberg's giving that money. Steve Jobs' foundation is giving that money, right? Like, we don't need to do this. He was really smart.
Yeah. And the money they give compared to what you're giving is nothing. The hospital's giving $5,000 to erect this, and you're giving a $5,000. Right.
And I love this too about Franklin. I think this is a point I think we should underline here, is that Franklin knew that fundraising, $20, $100, $500, those sort of donations are more valuable if you get more people giving small donations than one person giving a large donation, because those those people giving small donations are going to have a stake in seeing that the thing you build or the thing you're funding is maintained properly. And this is one thing I was fascinated by too in Philadelphia. Love this about Philly. You know, as the 100-year mark came up on what was Philly going to do with this first batch of money, it's Franklin's descendants who step forward and say, Philly, you've mismanaged this. You don't get this money. This is our money, and we're going to sue you for it. And I love, you know, de Tocqueville said that all American questions at the end come down to judicial ones. You know, that the Declaration of Independence was an indictment of the king. The Constitution was a contract. And I love that even Franklin's will becomes heavily litigated, where you have these amazing descendants like Elizabeth Duane Gillespie, you know, a leading feminist in Philadelphia in the late 19th century, who does the women's pavilion at the World's Fair. And you have Agnes Irwin, who's the first dean of Radcliffe College. And they're coming together with a name maybe you know or maybe you don't, George Wharton Pepper. I don't know how many people in Philly hear the name Pepper anymore, but he was so important to maintaining the legacy and saying, look, we have to make sure that these loans get back on the feet correctly and that we're going to build something great with Franklin's money.
Well, I guess we're still burying the lead. How much is left?
Right.
How much is left?
It's still in play today. So if you search, for example, okay, so in Boston, you can walk into his legacy, the Franklin Institute of Technology, wonderful trade school in Boston South End. And you can see young people learning to fix HVAC. You can see them learning robotics. You know, we're the ones who repair the robots, they say. We're not worried about the fourth industrial revolution. It's a wonderful school to walk through, and they're always struggling for money. You know, Harvard has a $50 billion endowment, and the Franklin School, from the day it was founded, has been running in the red and is always trying to get more money. So I hope the book brings some attention to them. In Philadelphia, you know, it built the Franklin Institute, which you mentioned in the beginning, one of, if not the best science museum in the United States. But it took 30 years for that museum to be built after Franklin's centennial gift. And it was George Wharton Pepper, the Philadelphia attorney, who came forward and said, I'm going to fundraise for this and we're going to make this happen. And his name isn't really present at the Franklin Institute. They have a Pepper room that you can rent for events, but it doesn't say who Pepper was. And I'd like to restore his memory a bit with this book. But the thing I love about this is that there was such an outcry in Philadelphia. A Philadelphia Inquirer reporter named Tom Farrick did a series of reports in the early 1990s about what is the city going to do with our money. And the city at that time said they were going to throw a big concert featuring Ben Vereen and Aretha Franklin. Ben Franklin, get it? And Farrick said, this is a joke. And so his reporting caused a lot of public hearings and a lot of public outcry. And eventually what happened is that Franklin's money he left for Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, a huge chunk of it went to the Philadelphia Foundation. And that foundation still maintains Franklin loans for young people who don't want to do a four-year college degree, but want to learn a trade or a craft. Another portion of the money went to these community foundations around Pennsylvania. So there's these county groups that also give Franklin fellowships. And sometimes they're $500, sometimes they're $1,000, but his money is invested and it's still circulating and still benefiting young people today.
Well, I'm looking down. I'm still listening to you. I'm looking down because I'm looking at your sources.
Yeah.
And let's close with that because the sources
800 plus. Yes.
I'm up to 128. And so, yeah, I want to warn readers. My ideal reader is my beloved mother that I mentioned earlier in the pod, you know, that my reader I'm aiming for is the person who's walking through the airport and is about to get on a long flight and wants a really good book, wants a real page turner. And so this is not an academic book. I've put all the sources in the back, but I write the book, and you can attest to this. I hope that I want it to be a character-driven, fun page turner and not a heavy stentorian history. Yeah, you don't have to read the source material, but if there's something in the book that you go, wow, I didn't know that, then you can go back, and it makes a big difference. And owning the bookstore, I realize, I always talk about this, the cover, which is great, the epigraphs, which are great, and basically the cover. And this book, April 12th, will be on the front table. But because it has a good cover, people are going to gravitate to it. Oh yeah, show it.
Oh no, see, I have this virtual, I can't do it. I have this virtual background.
no.
It won't turn up. Come on now. Come on.
I've tried it.
Wait, I'm turning off my background so I can show this. Oh boy, now I can't do this. See, I'm on this, I'm in this horrible office here. So I'm in this white cell that but look, here's the cover, everybody. Now I want to highlight something about this because I did not come up with this. I mentioned those badges of mourning that Congress refused to wear, the black armband. The book is in 3 acts. It's after his death, his afterlife, and his rebirth. And I also love that when you use this image that we all know so well, when you see it like this, you realize how sad his eyes look. This is a man that when he's dying feels like he's been maligned by the country that he helped found. And so I love the design. So thank you for paying attention. I always wondered, do covers sell books? Do they?
Oh, give me a break. It's the only.
It matters, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's why publishers pick the cover. They want to sell books. They're not going to let the author pick the cover. They might let you vet it a little bit.
That's a good point. It's a good point.
Your background looks like you're in purgatory.
I'm in a 1925 Japanese-built office that the building itself is gorgeous on this college campus when Taiwan was a Japanese colony. But the room itself has been remade over the years, so it's a lot of drywall and the popcorn ceiling sort of thing. Yeah. It's a great cell to write in, I have to say, but not for Zoom interviews.
Well, thank you so much. Again, I would ask you what your next book is, but since you go here, it could be about Grace Kelly. I don't know what it's going to be about.
That's a good idea. I bet she has great letters too. Yeah. I'm working on a book about a landmark obscenity trial in 1877 Victorian England, if you can believe this. A woman that sold a birth control pamphlet, she is an amazing person, and there are amazing letters. And that book is actually pretty far along and is going to come out. COVID delayed a lot of things, but that book comes out next year. And then right now I'm researching a biography of Taiwan. So I have 2 things going at once.
Well, I like what you said in that one NPR interview, basically, or C-SPAN, that when you want to write a book because you want to read the book, but it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. And so now it feels like a race against time in a lot of ways of like, I don't want anyone else to write this book. Like when the Ken Burns, when the Franklin thing came out, I thought, oh no, I spent 10 years on this book and they're going to do a whole thing about it. And, you can imagine my relief at the very, very end. There was 1 minute where they say, and then Franklin died. And in his will, he left some money for Boston and Philadelphia. That's all it said. And I was like, perfect. This book is part 3 of that miniseries one day.
Yeah, I know. And I said I'm ending, but I always do this. When I was researching, who knew out of all these things that he was the first tornado chaser?
Isn't that great? Another one of those facts I read that I was like, this is too good. I have to put it in.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And you could go, and then the thing is, we could go on for the next 3 hours just going over his inventions, and that's just the inventions. And then you go over the things he started, like the Pennsylvania Hospital, it's amazing.
So he's always at the Franklin Memorial there at the Franklin Institute. There's plaques on the side of his statue, and I think it says like statesman, inventor, legacy or something. But it doesn't say anything about philanthropist, which I think calling back these things like the Pennsylvania Hospital and these amazing things he founded in Philadelphia without putting his name on them, and it doesn't say anything about laborer. And maybe this is a good place to end. I love that in his will, he begins, I, Benjamin Franklin, printer. Of all his achievements, that's what he wanted to focus on first. And the codicil he added to his will, this last bet, was to make sure that Americans 200 plus years from now would still be talking about, hey, what are we doing to help the working class? Franklin said that good apprentices make the best citizens. They interact with people on the ground level. They see the effect of taxation and policy. They see people every day of all backgrounds, classes, creeds, origins, and they're the ones who should be more involved in our democracy. And I think it would break his heart if he came back today to say, well, The philanthropy we've nailed. We're very good at philanthropy. There's more not people employed by nonprofits in America than there is in manufacturing. But there's also less than 2% of our Congress people who have ever held a working class job. And I think that would break his heart.
Yeah, and the last thing is that, you can go to college like you and I did and get a degree in English literature or history, and then you got to decide, oh, well, should I work at Starbucks or should I get a teaching job? But being a welder is,
you'll never starve. You set your own hours. I tell my students, learn how to hang windows. Window installers are the happiest people I know. Honestly, you get a couple $100 per window. You set your schedule. You're not going to fall off the roof. Hopefully, it depends how high the windows are. You're going to work inside a lot. Yeah.
Well, I'm
there
like
are other paths to greatness than a 4-year college degree.
Yeah, and I'm like you. I compare myself to people like your mother who are smart, not like us. And my favorite job, and the one I'm best at, is laying sod. All you have to remember is green side up, and that's it.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. With that, since I love to get the last word, it's horrible. But in any event, thank you so much for talking to us again. And I look forward. Now I know what your next book is. It sounds exciting. So I'm looking forward to that one too.
I'll hope to talk to you next year.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.